Durag Wisdom here, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Y2K 19.08.05. I was a teacher for 30 years, and if it wasn't for my students, I would have failed at this task. I was a product, after all, of my parents, the greatest generation's public school system. The key to creating a great school system was to mirror the positive aspects of society in the schools so that students would adopt them as their own. These schools, my parents' schools, the greatest generation schools, had structure and programs. We learned how to put our school newspapers. We learned how to run a political campaign through student elections. And then we learned about voting because we had to vote for our student candidates. And we learned that we had to respect the authorities or incur their wrath and worse. The wrath of our parents, of course, the worse. We never heard of students cursing teachers, although we heard that such schools existed. We youngsters were held to a higher standard of behavior, and nowhere did we learn proper school behavior the most than from our beloved teachers. I had a hard time adjusting as a teacher in the baby bungler school system. In this system, students had rights, and unalienable rights. The right to curse the teachers, the right to assault them, and the right to disrupt their classrooms. Both parents work now, and the children are left to raise themselves. Instead of bringing their books, supplies, and work to class, my students were bringing their games, their junk food, their makeup kits, their music devices to class. It's a constant battle. The teaching staff is reduced to babysitting, while the administrators hired to help us undermined us instead. They thought they were better than us, sitting in their private offices, some of them with their own private little crap houses that they could take the bowel movements in private during the day. One of the greatest privileges of our society. Didn't help us though. I was used to a system in my childhood that demanded that students respected the teacher. A system where parents showed up to open school nights. In the first years of my career, when I was teaching emotionally disturbed and socially maladjusted students, hardly any parent showed up on parent-teacher night. We are responsible, us baby bunglers, for an entire generation of ignoramuses who may one day, and probably have already done so, take college courses in how to eat Tide cleaning pods without dying. Of course, that would be their children and the children beyond. Milked to the brim on reality show madness. It did not help that I had a bad temper when I was beginning my teaching career. I could have lost my job many times because of it. I took to putting a picture, get this, of James Caan as Sonny Corleone up on a window pane, and this is from the scene where he's looking and seeing that he's been trapped at this toll booth and realizes he's got this look on his face, he's about to die. His temper was well known by his enemies, and they used this tragic flaw as the trap to murder him. Didn't want to be murdered or fired, that'd be worse. I learned that students enjoyed seeing how far they could push me or any teacher. And they taught me something valuable. Something I also learned from one of my own teachers, Phil Anderson, great teacher from Hollywood High School. To be firm, fair, and friendly. I was his audio-visual monitor, the only one, by the way. I learned that I had the power to be an actual role model for proper behavior. In the latter part of my career, thankfully, I learned never to raise my voice in anger at my students, except in an emergency. To behave in a rational and friendly manner, to be fair to everyone. I told my students that I would not be screaming at them. I was always prepared with a lesson, and I was always engaged in discussion and teaching my students. No one would ever find me sleeping in front of a group of students. I found that once I wasn't losing my temper, that once I understood that these children were being neglected, that they weren't being led, they weren't being taught social skills, they weren't being taught civics, they responded in kind to my positive behavior by acting in a similar fashion. Cursing disappeared, children were calmer, I was able to joke around with them more and make them laugh. Don't get me wrong, it was not always smooth. Sometimes I lost it, but did so when they weren't sitting in front of me. These students taught me that a school teacher, the educational leader of a classroom, must behave in a manner that will encourage his or her students to model positive societal behaviors. You must also, as a teacher, be willing to give up some of your time. When I taught, I invited students to eat with me during lunch. I taught a movies and media class and used their lunch so they could watch movies and socialize in a non-chaotic way, unavailable to them if they stayed in the wild lunchroom. After all, their parents never taught many of these children the proper way to behave in a public dining room. If you were a teacher and unlucky enough to have lunch duty, you had to convince yourself that you weren't a part of a Three Stooges pie-throwing melee. Yes, my students taught me the importance of modeling good behavior, because the idea of setting a good example for others does not end with the classroom or with the teacher. Every adult must set a positive example so that future generations can survive on a planet that my generation, the bunglers, have been decimating. We have a baby bungler Nazi president, after all, who's decimating the planet. We have not been setting a good example. Again, even grown-ups need role models, and the role model picked to be president of the United States lacks every bit of humanity you can imagine. No empathy, no compassion, nothing but greed, nothing but race hatred, nothing but birtherism, Nazism, KK maggotry. And at the rally in Florida Panhandle, the infamous Florida Panhandle rally, Trump screamed and lamented about, "What am I going to do with these immigrants?" And someone answered, "Shoot them! Shoot them!" And Trump's role model answer was a smile followed by assurance that you can only get away with that in the Panhandle. Essentially, the Nazi hate-monger, birther bastard president of the USA, accidental president of the USA, was giving extremists permission to go hunting for people, especially immigrants and people of color, and yes, even Jews. To those Jews that support this creep, you're traitors to your people. Donald Birther Bastard would be a terrible teacher, as I am sure he was a terrible parent. I can't wait for his children to start writing truthful memoirs about life growing up with this monster Trump. He has set himself up as a role model for bigots and murderers, and we have plenty of them in this society, in America. Our dark side, our evil side that we have to suppress, that we have to eradicate. Everyone who is dying now from coast to coast in our besieged country because of gun violence, their blood is on the hair monster, empty head of Nazi birther bastard Cheeto Trump. If I had behaved the same way as a teacher, I would have been fired. Fortunately, I learned and developed as a professional and was a successful teacher at the time of my retirement, or by the time of my retirement. On the other hand, Trump has learned nothing about being president except that this narcissist, Nazi, sociopathic, birther bastard fiend believes that he can stay in office and say and do anything that he wishes. His hateful words have actually murdered people. Talk about carnage. He is a role model for hate and death. Why hasn't the birther bastard, Nazi, hair monster Trump been fired?